Let me be direct with you from the outset, because what unfolded in Ankara over the past 72 hours demands directness. What we are witnessing is not a diplomatic realignment. It is not Turkish posturing or Erdogan's typical brinkmanship. What we are witnessing is the quiet dismantling of NATO's southern flank, executed with precision that caught Washington completely off guard. I am looking at a confidential memorandum that has been circulating among European defense ministers for the past week. What it describes is not a Turkish veto on a minor procedural matter. It is not a temporary disagreement over military procurement. What it describes is Turkey's formal notification to the North Atlantic Council that it will no longer participate in NATO naval operations in the Eastern Mediterranean unless specific conditions are met, conditions that NATO cannot possibly accept, and conditions that were designed with exactly that impossibility in mind. In the next 21 minutes, I am going to walk you through exactly why Turkey just secured access to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization as an observer state, why Ankara is now coordinating energy infrastructure with Tehran and Moscow that bypasses every Western sanction regime, and why your government is pretending none of this is happening. This is geopolitical analysis you are not getting from mainstream sources. Subscribe now if you have not already, because what we are about to cover is being actively discussed in closed-door sessions at the State Department, and they are not sharing it with you. Let's start with geography, because Turkey's location is not an accident of history. It is the reason everything we are about to discuss matters. Turkey controls the Bosporus and Dardanelles Straits. These are not symbolic waterways. They are the only naval passage between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. Every Russian warship, every grain shipment from Ukraine, every energy tanker moving between the Caspian region and European markets must pass through Turkish waters. The Montreux Convention of 1936 governs this passage, and Turkey is the sole guarantor of that convention. To put that in perspective, approximately 25% of Europe's natural gas imports and 15% of its oil imports transit through or near Turkish-controlled territory. This means that Turkey does not simply occupy a strategic location. Turkey is the strategic location. When Ankara makes a move, it is not regional politics. It is global infrastructure recalibration. According to the International Energy Agency, Turkey processed over 400 billion cubic meters of natural gas through its pipeline networks in 2025 alone. Bloomberg reported in March 2026 that Turkish officials are now finalizing agreements with Iran, Russia, and Azerbaijan to expand that capacity by 30% within 18 months. The EU has publicly stated this expansion violates sanctions frameworks. Turkey has proceeded anyway. That is not defiance. That is a verdict on who holds leverage. Subscribe if you are watching this and realizing you are not getting this level of analysis anywhere else. Now let's talk about what Turkey actually built while the Western media was focused on other headlines. Announcement number one, the Iraqi Development Road Project. And this one matters more than anything else because it represents a complete bypass of the Suez Canal for overland trade between Asia and Europe. Turkey, Iraq, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates signed a binding framework agreement on April 2nd, 2026. The project is a 1,200-kilometer railway and highway corridor running from the port of Basra in southern Iraq through Baghdad and up to the Turkish border at Faish Kabur. From there, it connects directly to Turkish rail networks that terminate at European borders. The cost is $17 billion. Construction timelines indicate operational capacity by early 2029. According to reporting by the Financial Times and confirmed by multiple regional officials, this corridor will reduce shipping time from the Persian Gulf to Europe from 3 weeks via Suez to 9 days overland. More importantly, it will reduce costs by approximately 20% for containerized freight. Qatar's sovereign wealth fund has committed $4 billion. The UAE has committed $3.5 billion. Turkey has committed $2 billion. Iraq is covering the remainder through Chinese development loans. Turkey currently operates as the primary logistics hub for this entire corridor. That positioning matters because it means Turkish customs, Turkish regulatory frameworks, and Turkish infrastructure will control the flow. When 15 to 20% of Asia-Europe trade shifts to this route, and projections suggest it will, Turkey becomes indispensable. Not important. Indispensable. Received. That is announcement number one. Announcement number two, the Turkish-Iranian gas pipeline network expansion and the nuclear coordination framework. This is the part the United States has confirmed but refuses to discuss publicly. On March 27th, just days before the Iraq corridor announcement, Turkish Energy Minister Alparslan Bayraktar met with Iranian Oil Minister Javad Auji in Tehran. They did not meet for ceremonial purposes. They signed a memorandum of understanding to triple the capacity of the existing Tabriz-Ankara gas pipeline from 10 billion cubic meters annually to 30 billion cubic meters annually by 2028. That increase alone would supply nearly 40% of Turkey's domestic gas consumption and position Turkey as a re-export hub to the Balkans and southern Europe. But that is not the critical development. The critical development is what was discussed in the closed session immediately following that signing. According to three separate diplomatic sources who were briefed on the meeting, Turkey and Iran agreed to coordinate on civilian nuclear energy development, specifically related to uranium enrichment technologies. Turkey framed this as compliance with International Atomic Energy Agency standards. Iran described it as technical knowledge sharing between regional partners. Stay with me because this is where the narrative completely changes and where the implications for American sanctions policy become impossible to ignore. Turkey is a NATO member state. Turkey hosts American nuclear weapons at Incirlik Air Base. Turkey is now coordinating nuclear development with a state that the United States has sanctioned for precisely that activity. The cognitive dissonance is intentional. It forces Washington into an impossible position. Sanction Turkey and lose access to Incirlik, the Bosporus, and any remaining influence over Kurdish regions in Syria and Iraq. Do not sanction Turkey and admit that the entire sanctions architecture against Iran has collapsed. Announcement number 3, and this one almost nobody in the mainstream media is connecting correctly. Turkey formally applied for dialogue partner status with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization on April 15, 2026. The application was accepted within 72 hours. That speed is unprecedented. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, for those unfamiliar, is not a symbolic talking shop. It is a security and economic bloc comprising China, Russia, India, Pakistan, Iran, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan. Together, these states represent over 40% of the global population and 30% of global GDP. Dialogue partner status is the first formal step toward full membership. Turkey's acceptance was personally endorsed by Chinese President Xi Jinping and Russian President Vladimir Putin during the emergency virtual summit held on April 16. According to Reuters, Xi described Turkey's participation as reflecting the multipolar reality of the 21st century. Putin stated that NATO's expansion had created the conditions for regional powers to seek alternative security arrangements. Neither statement was diplomatic pleasantry. Both were strategic declarations. The reason this matters is the same reason every development we have discussed matters. Turkey is not abandoning NATO formally. Turkey is making NATO membership functionally irrelevant by building parallel structures that serve Turkish interests without requiring Washington's approval. That is not hedging. That is transition. Received. That is announcement number 3. Now let's talk about what is really happening behind the headlines, because there are two stories playing out simultaneously, and the Western media is only covering one of them. The first story is the one you are seeing. Diplomatic statements, reassurances about Turkish commitment to the alliance, speculation about Erdogan's domestic political motivations, analysis framing this as temporary friction. The second story is the one you are not seeing. Turkey has conducted 4 high-level military-to-military consultations with Russian defense officials since February 2026. These were not publicized. They occurred in neutral third-country locations. The topics discussed included joint air defense coordination in Syria, intelligence sharing on Kurdish militant networks, and deconfliction protocols for overlapping areas of operation in the Black Sea region. Think carefully about what this represents. When a NATO member state conducts military coordination meetings with Russia, and those meetings are deliberately kept off the public record, that is not diplomatic outreach. That is operational security. It means the coordination is substantive enough that public acknowledgement would trigger alliance responses neither party wants to deal with yet. Secretary of State Antony Blinken responded to questions about Turkish-Russian military cooperation in a press briefing on April 21st by stating that the United States respects Turkey's sovereign right to engage diplomatically with all nations. This has not notably changed Turkey's behavior. What it has changed is the willingness of European NATO members to follow Washington's lead on Turkey policy. France, Germany, and Italy have each sent senior officials to Ankara in the past 2 weeks. They are not delivering ultimatums. They are asking what Turkey needs to stay engaged. That is the geopolitical equivalent of a fire sale. If you own a business with supply chains running through Turkey, what is happening in Ankara is not a foreign policy story. It is a logistics cost story. If you rely on natural gas imports that transit Turkish pipelines, it is an energy security story. If you are invested in European defense stocks predicated on NATO cohesion, it is a portfolio risk story. These effects are already showing up in freight insurance premiums, energy futures pricing, and defense sector volatility. The market is pricing in Turkish autonomy faster than governments are willing to acknowledge it publicly. This pattern has repeated throughout history, and every time it repeats, the outcome is the same: the Peloponnesian War. Athens and Sparta went to war, 27 years. Both city-states were utterly exhausted by the end. Their economies were destroyed, their populations were decimated, and who won? Macedon. Philip II and later his son Alexander swept in and conquered the entire Greek world because the two great powers had bled each other dry fighting over regional dominance. The parallel here is exact. The United States is Athens, technologically advanced, naval dominant, economically powerful but overstretched. Russia is Sparta, land power focused, resource rich, willing to endure hardship. Both are locked in a proxy confrontation across Ukraine, Syria, the Caucasus, and now the Eastern Mediterranean. Both are spending blood and treasure. And who is rising while they fight? China. But in this regional context, the actor gaining the most immediate leverage is Turkey. Turkey is not Macedon in terms of global power projection. But in the corridor between Europe, the Middle East, and Central Asia, Turkey is positioning exactly as Macedon did, letting the great powers exhaust themselves while building the infrastructure, the alliances, and the economic networks that will define the next generation of trade and security. When the current confrontation reaches its inevitable stalemate or resolution, Turkey will control the roads, the pipelines, the ports, and the relationships. That is not prediction. That is geometry. So where does this leave us? Let me give you three clear paths, because there is no honest middle ground here. Path 1: reconciliation and reintegration. The United States and European NATO members offer Turkey meaningful concessions. This could include lifting opposition to Turkish operations against Kurdish groups in Syria, providing advanced air defense systems without strings attached, and accepting Turkish energy cooperation with Iran and Russia as a fait accompli. In exchange, Turkey scales back its Shanghai Cooperation Organization engagement and returns to active participation in NATO Mediterranean operations. Likelihood assessment: low. Washington has demonstrated repeatedly that it views concessions as weakness, and the domestic political cost of appearing to reward Turkish defiance is too high for any current administration to absorb. Path 2: managed separation. NATO and Turkey maintain formal alliance ties but functionally operate in separate spheres. Turkey continues building its Eurasian infrastructure and security partnerships. NATO continues its operations without expecting Turkish participation. Both sides avoid public rupture but accept the reality of diverged interests. This path allows everyone to save face. It avoids the trauma of Turkish expulsion or withdrawal, but it also formalizes NATO's loss of control over the Bosporus, Incirlik, and the Eastern Mediterranean. Likelihood assessment: moderate to high. This is the path of least resistance for all parties, which is precisely why it is the most probable. Path 3: full rupture and realignment. A crisis event, whether in Syria, the Aegean, or Ukraine, forces an open break. Turkey either withdraws from NATO or is functionally isolated within the alliance to the point where membership becomes meaningless. Turkey accelerates its integration into Shanghai Cooperation Organization frameworks, formalizes a mutual defense understanding with Russia, and becomes the primary energy and logistics bridge between Asia and Europe outside Western institutional control. Likelihood assessment: low in the next 12 months, but rising significantly over a 3 to 5 year horizon if current trends continue. I think we are closer to Path 2 than the headlines suggest. The infrastructure investments Turkey is making are not reversible. The Iraqi development road project alone commits Ankara to a decade-long integration trajectory with Gulf states and Asian markets. The energy agreements with Iran are locked in by contracts that include penalty clauses for non-performance. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization dialogue partnership creates institutional inertia toward deeper engagement. These are not tactical moves. These are structural commitments. But here's the part that should concern anyone watching this from Washington or Brussels. Turkey is not making these moves out of ideological alignment with Beijing or Moscow. Turkey is making these moves because the Western alliance stopped offering anything Turkey actually needs. Security guarantees that exclude operations against Kurdish militants are worthless to Ankara. Economic integration that excludes energy cooperation with neighbors is economically irrational. Defense partnerships that deny Turkey advanced weapons systems while expecting Turkish bases and airspace are humiliating. The West lost Turkey not because Erdogan is anti-Western. The West lost Turkey because the cost-benefit analysis of alignment shifted and nobody in Washington or Brussels was willing to adjust the terms. Here are the questions I want you to take away. First, what does NATO actually control if it does not control the Bosporus? Second, can the European Union maintain energy security if Turkey acts as a semi-independent broker rather than a compliant transit state? Third, what does it mean for American force projection in the Middle East if Incirlik becomes politically unusable? Tell me in the comments what you think Washington does next. Tell me if you believe Path 2 is sustainable or if we are inevitably heading toward Path 3. Tell me what angle you think is being most underreported in this entire realignment. We will keep tracking every development out of Ankara, Tehran, Moscow, and Beijing as this story unfolds. That is what this channel does every single day. Serious analysis of the moves that matter, not the headlines designed to distract you. Subscribe now. Share this analysis with everyone in your network who is trying to understand what is actually happening in the Eastern Mediterranean and why it will affect energy prices, supply chains, and security arrangements for the next decade. Turn on notifications so you do not miss the next update, and we will see you in the next analysis.